Welcome back, everybody, to this series of Pharos lectures for this term on just war, and to this final lecture on international law and just war ethics. Law is given before it's made. Legal statutes and social contracts aren't crafted in a moral wasteland. They're born accountable to a higher natural law, and their word is neither first nor last. If that were not so, the Nuremberg trials were nothing but victor's vengeance dressed up in a fiction of justice. And today's high-blown rhetoric of universal human rights is just so much wind. That is the moral realism that the Christian doctrine of just war, both early and late, takes for granted. It assumes that there is a universal moral order that transcends national legal systems and applies to international relations, even in the absence of positive international law. When I use the word positive, what I mean is man-made or conventional. It's posited by human convention. This Christian doctrine believes that there are human goods and moral obligations that exist in and with the nature of things in some sense, and which exercise a guiding and constraining moral authority long before human beings articulate them in statutes or treaties. It holds that the principles of moral law are given before positive laws are made. So the tradition is well expressed by Hugo Grotius, and it is contrary to Thomas Hobbes. One thing this implies is that military action can sometimes be morally justified in the absence of, and even in spite of, statutory or customary international law. For that reason, the doctrine's proponents can't join those, including philosophical proponents of just war, who believe that the legitimacy of military intervention to prevent or halt grave injustice is decided simply by the presence or absence of authorization by the United Nations Security Council. Positive law can't have the final word. A common objection to appeals to natural moral law is that it is indeterminate and controversial. Positive law itself, however, is not beyond controversy, as we'll see shortly. What is more, one truth made manifest by the experience of Nazi rule is that the murderous killing of the innocent on a massive scale can be legally permissible, and that its condemnation therefore requires appeal to principles of justice that go beyond positive law. Before the Second World War, the professor of law and politician Gustav Radbruch was a legal positivist. In 1946, however, he wrote a now famous essay, Gesetzliches Unrecht und übergesetzliches Recht, legal injustice and more than legal justice. In this he argued that there can be cases where the discrepancy between positive law and justice reaches such an unbearable degree that the former must be deemed wrong. Indeed, there may be cases where positive law doesn't even attempt justice, and where equality is abandoned, in which case the statute doesn't partake of the nature of law at all. That, he wrote, is because law, including positive law, can only be defined as an order and statute whose very meaning is precisely to serve more than legal justice. This view is now referred to as the Radbruch formula, which has been applied many times by both the German Federal Constitutional Court and the Federal Court of Justice, originally in cases concerned with Nazi crimes. In the case of the intervention of NATO in Kosovo in 1999, the widespread view that that intervention was at once illegal and morally right implies a significant measure of international consensus on natural principles of justice transcending positive international law. None of this is to say that in the eyes of morally realist just war doctrine, positive international law carries no moral weight itself. There are good moral reasons of a prudential sort why we should be loath to transgress positive law, even for the noblest of motives. And the case for this is made with memorable rhetorical force in A Man for All Seasons, Robert Bolt's magnificent play about Sir Thomas More. In one scene, More is urged by his daughter Margaret and his future son-in-law Nicholas Roper to arrest Richard Rich, an informer. The subsequent argument rises to this climax. Margaret, exasperated, pointing to Rich, "While you talk, he's gone." More, "And go he should, if he was the devil himself, until he broke the law." Roper, "So now you'd give the devil benefit of law?" More, "Yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil?" Roper, "I'd cut down every law in England to do that." More, "Oh? And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, Roper, the laws all being flat? This country's planted thick with laws from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down, and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I'd give the devil benefit of law, for my own safety's sake." The law's power to order a society, national or international, and so to safeguard the rights of its members consists primarily in its authority, as distinct from its capability of physical force. And this authority consists in the willingness to obey of those it commands. Obedience can be volunteered for a variety of reasons, including the conviction that what the law requires is morally right and socially beneficial. Certainly, with all due respect to Hobbes and his followers, the fear of sanction is not the only motive for compliance, nor is it a necessary one. And that's evidenced by the fact that most citizens feel bound by domestic laws that are only haphazardly enforced, and most states comply with international law despite the absence of a global executive authority. Nonetheless, the readiness of subjects to volunteer obedience is partly sustained by confidence that perpetrators of grave violations of the law expose themselves to serious threat of sanction, and that not infrequently they suffer it. If the law is not so enforced, and if grave lawbreakers are seen to act with frequent impunity, then the respect of the obedient for the law will be shaken, and its authority tend to diminish. And if this diminution proceeds far enough, then the rule of law will disintegrate, and society will dissolve into anarchy. And those who have taken advantage of others' law-abidingness will find themselves reduced to an equality of defenselessness, the laws all being flat. Usually, of course, those who disobey the law do so in order to gain some private advantage, material goods, say, or an increase in political power. But sometimes people are moved to break the law in pursuit of justice. That's because there are occasions when those with the power to enforce the law can't do so, typically because they don't have sufficient evidence to make an arrest or secure a conviction. And in those cases, private bodies might be moved to take the law into their own hands in order to administer rough justice to those whom they know, or presume to know, are criminals. As a rule, however, they shouldn't. Why? Because the laws governing law enforcement are in place to protect the innocent against wrongful arrest and excessive punishment on mistaken or fraudulent grounds. This is a protection that would-be vigilantes expect for themselves, so they can't consistently deny it to others. Further, if they do so without penalty, their action would diminish the law's authority and discourage its observance by suggesting it serves only to disadvantage the weak in relation to the strong. So for the sake of the general order and peace that ensues from prevalent respect for the law, particular pursuits of justice must be legally constrained, even at the expense of letting the devil himself escape. Or if not quite the devil, then, as some argued in relation to the Kosovo War in 1999, Slobodan Milosevic and his forces. One of the most basic objections raised by critics of NATO's military intervention in Kosovo was that, lacking authorization by the Security Council, it presumed to run roughshod over international law, thereby weakening the law's authority and setting a precedent for any sufficiently powerful state to invade another sovereign territory on moral grounds of its own choosing. As a result, it was argued, the security of states everywhere had been weakened and relations between them made more distrustful. NATO's high-handed action had made the world a considerably more dangerous place. That, however, was only one view, for the legal status of NATO's action was and is a point of controversy on which eminent experts in international law have taken opposing sides. There is no doubt that the text of the UN Charter forbids the unilateral use of force except in self-defense, and that it restricts all other use of force to what is specifically mandated by the UN Security Council for the maintenance of international security and peace. The problem with this is that, as it stands, the Charter itself could outlaw military action necessary to stop genocide. Suppose a Hitler decides upon a final solution for a minority group within the borders of his own state. Suppose he cannot be dissuaded from this policy by diplomatic or economic pressure. Suppose he restrains himself from invading a neighbour or otherwise posing a threat to regional security. And suppose the politics of the Security Council preclude sufficient unanimity to enable armed intervention by an authorised body because one of the permanent members would veto it. Then the letter of international law, as we now have it, would allow the final solution to run its course. Christian just war thinking, as expressed by that patriarch of international law, Hugo Grotius, has a response to this. In cases of judicium cessans, where judgment or courts are absent or lacking, or where the law is not being enforced, cases where public authority fails to enforce the law against grave and massive injustice, the natural unilateral right to oppose it by force revives, other prudential things being equal. Many prominent figures on the unthinking left doubted that in intervening in Kosovo, NATO's motives were genuinely humanitarian. In other just war terms, they doubted that it met the criterion of right intention. Ian Brownlee, the Chichili Professor of Public International Law at this university, spoke knowingly and darkly of a geopolitical agenda unrelated to human rights, while declining to explain. The playwright Harold Pinter, expressing the traditional prejudices of the British left, proposed the motive of American domination, and I quote, "The truth is that neither Clinton nor Blair gives a damn about the Kosovo Albanians. The action has been yet another blatant and brutal assertion of US power using NATO as its missile. It sets out to consolidate one thing, American domination of Europe." The patriarch of post-colonialism, Edward Said, followed suit, collapsing NATO into the US and asserting that the Kosovo intervention was basically, quote, "a display of American military might to show the world who's boss." Never mind that earlier in the 1990s, European nations had proven perfectly capable of distancing themselves from American foreign policy when they saw fit to do so, for example, over Iraq. Never mind that in the forefront of NATO's military intervention stood France, which has made a post-war career of not doing whatever America wants. Never mind that America's military involvement in Kosovo was patently reluctant, to the frustration of at least one European leader, Tony Blair. And never mind that America's reluctance is intelligible precisely because its national interest in the outcome of the Kosovo conflict, as distinct from the interest of its European allies, was so weak. It's certainly true that NATO, but much less its North American than its European members, had an interest in the stability of the Balkans and therefore in curbing the activity of the main source of recent disturbance, Milosevic and his regime. But this interest was not private to NATO. It was shared presumably by the Balkan peoples themselves. Indeed, it was shared by the UN, whose Security Council had adopted 3 resolutions in 1998, which legally bound the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to cease all action by its security forces affecting the civilian population of Kosovo, to withdraw all security units used for civilian repression, and to implement in full all agreements with NATO and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. These, together with the statements following the Racak massacre in January 1999, judged that the government in Belgrade had created a humanitarian emergency in Kosovo that constituted a threat to peace and security in the Balkans. The Kosovo crisis augmented the grist, but Kofi Annan's mill was already grinding. Upon his appointment as Secretary General of the UN in 1997, Annan had begun to press the international community to achieve a greater measure of collective clarity over humanitarian intervention by explicitly affirming what he asserted to be, quote, this developing international norm in favor of intervention to protect civilians from wholesale slaughter, and by agreeing rules for its effective application under international law. The choice, he told the UN's General Assembly in September 1999, must not be between Security Council unity and inaction in the face of genocide, as in the case of Rwanda on the one hand, and Council division and regional action, as in the case of Kosovo on the other. Sadly, notwithstanding the support he received from the report of the Canadian government's International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, called The Responsibility to Protect, Annan's efforts proved to be in vain. The debate he had stimulated was overshadowed by the highly controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003, which stiffened opposition to any loosening of the reins on unilateral action. As a consequence, the report of the Secretary General's high-level panel on UN reform in 2004, the Secretary General's own report of September 2005, and the outcome document of the 2005 UN World Summit all reaffirmed the prohibition on the use of force without prior Security Council authorization, except in the case of armed attack. And the panel expressly rejected the claim that force can sometimes be legitimate, even if unlawful. There is therefore no guarantee that the Council will act when arguably it should, even in the case of a developing genocide. And the question of what should happen in such a case remains unresolved. According to the Handbook of the International Law of Military Operations, the minority view is that humanitarian intervention either does not violate the UN Charter or is part of customary law. Most legal authorities, however, judge that unauthorized humanitarian intervention is prima facie illegal, but that it can be, quote, legitimized and wholly or partially justified under certain conditions, which provide grounds for partial or complete mitigation of responsibility for otherwise illegal conduct. End of quote. Now that way of putting it seems to me to be ambiguous. On the one hand, it seems to say that an act that is illegal prima facie at first sight can be made legal by mitigating circumstances. But the normal understanding of mitigation is that it reduces the responsibility of the agent, not the unlawfulness of his act. What the handbook is trying to say, I think, is that circumstances can render an act that is illegal morally justified. But its articulation is mangled because it's shy of appealing, as just war reasoning would not be shy, to a moral authority above positive law. It is shy of appealing to natural law or morality, and yet significantly it finds it must, but it does so obliquely. The justification of going to war can't always confine itself to positive law. Sometimes, when the devil is wreaking egregious, massive, atrocious havoc, it has to take the risks of transgressing the law by appeal to overriding moral duty. Nonetheless, a moral justification can't ride roughshod, cavalierly over the law. It must pay it the respect of making as good a legal case as it can. And this is because the rule of law fosters the good of international order. Even those who continue to doubt the ultimately moral justification proposed will appreciate the proposer's readiness to be accountable before the law. A measure of trust of moral community will be maintained, and because the advocate of unilateral action shows himself not to be a contemptuous rogue elephant, the law's authority will be preserved or at least minimally damaged. Right, responsible process may not secure agreement on the truth, but it does help to shore up community and authority in the midst of substantive disagreement. Besides, there is more than one way to corrode the law's authority. Wanton violation is the obvious one, but failure to act against gross and massive violation of human rights is surely another. That is precisely why Kofi Annan sought to move the international community to affirm the norm of humanitarian intervention, together with a legal way of undertaking it in case of Security Council paralysis. Most states, most of the time, will strive to find a legal justification for what they do. After all, they are ruled and represented by rational human beings who are troubled by their own inconsistency and who like to think of themselves as doing the right thing. Even the Nazis felt the need to rationalize legally and morally. They also care to maintain their reputation as law-abiding for the sake of international trust and diplomatic leverage. Moreover, having participated in the creation, interpretation, and development of international law, they will have come to own its norms, or at least a certain version of them. Nevertheless, states, like international lawyers, have been moved to recognize the distinction between legality and moral legitimacy, and that the latter can override the former. So with regard to military intervention in defense of the Kurds in northern Iraq in 1991, the French argued that, and I quote, "The law is one thing, but the safeguard of a population is another, quite as precious, to which humanity cannot be indifferent." And of international lawyers on NATO's intervention in Kosovo, Martti Koskaniemi, the Finnish diplomat and philosopher of law, has written that, quote, "Most lawyers, including myself, have taken the ambivalent position that it was both formally illegal and morally necessary." Some regard this line of thinking with great suspicion. Mary Ellen O'Connell, for example, refers to the dangerous idea about force sometimes being legitimate, even if unlawful. She complains that its advocates don't show how the authority of the UN Charter and Security Council can survive it, and she notes that it is espoused by some just war scholarship, and argues that the doctrine can have little restraining force when the determination of justice is a subjective one. Martti Koskaniemi raises similar objections to what he calls shallow and dangerous moralization of international law. To appeal beyond the law's text to its deeper logical purposes is to claim access to an objective moral world which is controversial. To rise above formal law and decide its meaning is to make a decision that, to quote Carl Schmitt, is born out of legal nothingness. Moral conscience, being emotional, subjective and private, is no substitute. What purports to be ethics is really nothing but politics. Therefore, what the exception of Kosovo reveals is the will and power of a handful of Western leaders, and a preoccupation with the morality of their decision-making serves to obscure the violent injustice of a global system where, quote, "It's never Algeria that will intervene in France or Finland and Chechnya." Intervention, according to Koskaniemi, remains a political act, however much it is dressed in the language of moral compulsion or legal technique. Set against this, the value of legal formalism becomes clear. It keeps decision-makers accountable to other members of the international community, and it constrains them to serve common interests. To all these objections, some of them O'Connell's, most of them Koskaniemi's, I respond as follows. First of all, the fact that foreign policy decisions include political considerations does not render them ipso facto immoral. Politics and ethics needn't be mutually exclusive. Second, the ethical deliberations of conscience are not essentially private. Their reasoning can be articulated, exposed to public criticism, and found more or less cogent. Koskaniemi himself admits that most international lawyers are persuaded that the Kosovo intervention was both legal and morally right, and that strongly suggests that ethics is not a merely private, capricious, irrational, subjective endeavour. Third, as I've already argued, the cynical interpretation of NATO's motivation in intervening in Kosovo simply doesn't withstand the facts. There is good reason, good empirical reason, to suppose that it was genuinely humanitarian. Fourth, the fact that there were larger and deeper injustices in the world deserving attention in 1999 does not mean that Serbian ethnic cleansing in Kosovo was either just or unimportant, and that it was wrong of NATO to give it the time of day. Fifth and finally, how far unauthorized, formally illegal intervention would weaken the authority of international law and institutions depends very largely on how successful are the intervening states in persuading others of their ethical case. States that fear international intervention, should they ever embark on genocide and its like, will of course never be persuaded. Others, however, might be. In the case of Kosovo, the Security Council had been unable to authorize NATO's intervention because Russia threatened to cast its veto. However, when Russia subsequently proposed a resolution condemning the intervention, the Council refused by a vote of 12-3. NATO's action then was at once not expressly authorized, and yet expressly not condemned by a majority of 4-1. When the Security Council itself refuses to condemn unauthorized intervention by such a margin, it's not unreasonable to infer that a majority of the international community has been persuaded of the humanitarian motivation, the public spiritedness, the necessity, and the proportionality of the action. That's to say, they have been persuaded by the moral case. What's more, such action has not actually set a precedent for rogue states to ride cavalierly over international law. And if that's so, then how exactly has the law's authority been weakened at all? Before I leave Kosovo and move to Gaza, let me lift our eyes from the particulars of the case and state the important truths that I've derived from it. First, even international lawyers sometimes feel the need to invoke an authority higher than that of conventional positive international law. They have difficulty finding the right words, avoiding using the word moral to specify it, but in truth, they are referring to culturally transcendent natural moral law, which is exactly what the Western Christian just war tradition does. Second, what this shows is that the letter of international law should not be the final word, with all due respect to the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his Attorney General Baron Hermer and Philip Stans. Appeal to law shouldn't be used as a means of avoiding the burden of making moral judgments, because no law anticipates all circumstances, and sometimes the law is an ass, and sometimes worse, it would shield the perpetration of genocide. That said, and this is the third point, the authority of the rule of law is important for international order and peace. So it should only be breached when a bona fide case within the terms of the law has been made, at least as a serious gesture of respect for its authority. The law should not be treated with contempt by those whose consciences tell them to break it. Quite the opposite. Ideally, the decision to break the law should be made by a diversity of countries to make clear that the reason for the violation is not the selfish national interest of the arrogant rogue state. In this respect, it was significant that NATO's intervention in Kosovo involved 40 countries, including both Greece and Turkey, who are usually at loggerheads with one another. In addition, a concerted diplomatic effort should be made to persuade other states of the legal moral case for lawbreaking, at least to demonstrate that the transgression is not cavalier and contemptuous, but conscientious. But the main point remains that international law is not the final authority, and sometimes states are morally obliged to break it. I'm going to conclude by shifting focus from humanitarian intervention in Kosovo to the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and to identify another feature of contemporary thinking about international law that sits at odds with traditional just war ethics, namely certain concepts of absolute human rights. It is a remarkable feature of the Western Christian tradition of just war thinking that it does not make use of the concept of a right at all, in stark contrast to post-1945 philosophical just war thinking. When it comes to decisions about discrimination and proportionality in warfighting, the older Christian tradition leaves them up to warfighters' discretion. Whether or not non-combatants should be put at risk or not is left entirely in the hands of combatants' consciences. The reason for this, as I understand it, is that combatants must make instant decisions under conditions of the most intense pressures of danger and time. It is inevitable that sometimes in the fog of war and heat of battle, they will make honest mistakes with tragic results, for which they should not be blamed. Except in egregious cases, they should be given the benefit of doubt, not least by people judging from armchairs with the advantage of hindsight. Were non-combatants to be granted legal rights against harm, even conditional rights, it would paralyze military decision-making with fear of retrospective judgment made by civilian judges with no experience of battle. And military decision-making that is paralyzed will almost certainly lead to military defeat, especially in the case of small militaries like the British one, whose success depends heavily on the free and swift initiative of junior officers. Moreover, academic talk about the rights of non-combatants too often slides into public talk of their immunity from harm, so that any military effects causing harm become unlawful. In other words, it's true that philosophers can affirm a conditional right to civilians against harm under certain conditions, but I notice in popular discussion the conditions get forgotten and this becomes an absolute immunity. The issue of whether or not those effects were intended drops completely out of the picture. Why does this matter? Because war can seldom be waged successfully without putting non-combatants at risk, and because sometimes winning a war is very, very important. The International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister and former Defense Minister in November last year illustrates the danger of intruding rights talk into the laws of war, which have been based on the just war ethic. As I reported last week, the ICC claims reasonable grounds for believing Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant guilty of the war crimes of, quote, intentionally and knowingly depriving the civilian population in Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, creating conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction, end of quote. Their grounds are these: Israel's failure to facilitate relief by all means at its disposal, and to ensure that the civilian population would be adequately supplied with goods in need. That amounts to a violation of the fundamental rights to life and health. Now, in my last lecture, I discussed the ICC's flawed understanding of intention. Here, I focus on the second flaw, the idea of an absolute fundamental human right to the necessities of life and health. This I frankly consider to be nonsense. Suppose a situation where no water is available, or no one is capable of supplying it, or those capable of supplying it have overriding obligations forbidding them to do so. How can those dying of thirst be supposed to have a right to what can't or may not be delivered? A fundamental human need only amounts to a right where supply exists and delivery is possible and obligatory. So whether or not civilians in Gaza have a right to water depends on Israeli intentions, the importance of their military objectives, and their attempts to minimize civilian risks. But that is not how the ICC sees it. In its eyes, the fundamental right to the necessities of life have obliged Israel to ensure that civilians are given adequate provision. Its provision of humanitarian relief, as far as allowed by the exigencies of waging war against an atrociously murderous, intentionally genocidal Hamas, is not adequate. The right is absolute, according to the ICC. Such strong, unyielding rights talk sits ill with the court's implicit gesture toward the traditional interpretation of the law of armed conflict, when it says it found reasons for believing that no clear military need could be identified for Israel's restrictions on humanitarian relief operations. In other words, despite evidence of Israeli military necessity, it was not clear in the court's eyes. Yet why a body of 18 professional lawyers with no military experience between them should prefer its own armchair judgment is a puzzle. Had it been sitting in judgment on the prosecution of the war against the massively murderous Nazi empire by Britain and the US, the ICC would have issued arrest warrants for Churchill and Eisenhower. While invading Italy in 1943, the Allies caused old men, women and children to be torn apart by bombs and shells, exposed to the wintry elements by the destruction of their homes, and starved of food and water. They did this knowingly, aware of the effects of their unavoidably imprecise bombing and shelling. But they did not intend civilian harm, and they sought to minimize it, as far as war winning allowed. Nevertheless, their efforts were not adequate to save tens of thousands from perishing. The presumptuousness of a court that declares itself devoted not merely to upholding the law, but to the cause of lasting peace, its novel and imprudent intrusion of a concept of fundamental human rights into the laws of war, and its neglect of the principle of double effect, all combine to drive a legal interpretation that makes successful warfighting unlawful, however just its cause. Thereby, I fear, the ICC is undermining its own authority by forcing states intent on military victory to repudiate its jurisdiction. Thank you very much.